Good morning, everyone. I think we're going to get started, so please join us. It's wonderful to see you all, and it's a beautiful day again here this morning. I'm Daphne Linzer. I'm the executive editor of Politico. I'm not going to lie, this is a weighty topic because these are weighty times. Examining how the UN and other international institutions should be responding to war in Ukraine and alleged atrocities committed by Russia and what it would take to hold Russia accountable. We are so fortunate to be here with the two people who can help us understand this the best. Each served as the State Department legal advisor in successive administrations that dealt with Russian aggression. And I'm honored to introduce them both to you. I'm going to start with John Bellinger. John has devoted much of his career to serving this country on national security and intelligence matters, from the White House and the State Department, the Justice Department, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and from the CIA. He is among the best experts on national security and international law. And although he's in private practice now, John continues to serve as a member of the Secretary of State's Advisory Committee on International Law. Harold Hangju Ko is among the foremost legal scholars in this country on international law, which he has been writing about and teaching about and practicing for much of his career, beginning in the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department, later as Dean of Yale Law School, and then as legal advisor at the State Department under former President Obama. He represents Ukrainian President Zelensky before the International Court of Justice. It is my hope that we can learn from you both today and also hopefully come away with some new ideas on how best to harness the international tools at our disposal to bring accountability and justice to this situation. We'll begin, the three of us, and then I'm going to invite you to join us with questions. John, let me start with you. Because President Zelensky has been clear about his frustration, to put it mildly, with the UN. He said Russia should be expelled from the UN. He wants the UN to investigate Russian attacks. In April, he said this of Russia: "We are dealing with a state that is turning the veto in the UN Security Council into the right to die. This undermines the whole architecture of global security and allows them to go unpunished." I want to ask you, one, is Zelensky right? Is the UN failing Ukraine and the principles of international law that it was founded to protect?
Well, thank you first for having me here. Nice to see you all. And I have to say, introducers never get any introduction, but I hope you all know that Daphne Linzer was, in fact, the person who broke the Alito draft opinion story when she had just moved to the editor of Politico in 2 months. So thank you for doing that, Daphne. I wish the end of the story had worked out a little bit better, but that was not your job.
Kind.
And it's always nice to be here with Harold, who was my successor as legal advisor, and who we spend a lot of time together. So unfortunately, this is a weighty topic. Zelensky is right to a large extent. He points to a weakness in the UN Charter and in the UN system that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, there are 15 members of the Security Council, 10 of them rotate, 5 of them are permanent: Russia, China, the US, UK, and France. And any of those 5 permanent members can veto any binding resolution, and they do. Russia has wielded its veto 120 times over the last 70 some odd years, and so this most recent veto of what was a very powerful resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine and ordering them to leave is just par for the course for Russia. They've done this in the past, and they've done it again. And so unfortunately, it is a flaw in the UN system. It's happened in other cases, like the mass atrocities in Syria, where Russia vetoed 16 successive resolutions that tried to do something about the humanitarian situation in Syria. So to that extent, there is a problem with the UN Charter and with the Security Council. There's not really a good way around it. It's very hard to amend the Charter. It hasn't been amended for 50 years. It requires a 2/3 vote of the General Assembly, and all 5 members of the permanent members of the Security Council have to agree, which obviously Russia is not going to do. So we're sort of stuck in that regard. There have been efforts over time to try to reform the Security Council and the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the problems that Zelensky has pointed out have again raised calls for UN Security Council reform. In the past, there have been efforts to try to enlarge the Security Council to make it more representative, so it's not just the countries that have been there for 50 years. There have been efforts to get countries to voluntarily not veto resolutions involving aggression or atrocities, but unfortunately you're going to not get many of the members to do that. There have been talk about trying to amend the charter so that a supermajority could override a veto, but of course, again, the 5 permanent members have to agree to do that. So Zelensky puts his finger on a flaw in the UN system, and there's not a good way around that. What that's meant is that we have moved some of the action to the UN General Assembly, which sort of like our House of Representatives. That's where all 193 countries are represented. And when the Security Council resolution was vetoed by Russia, the action promptly moved to the General Assembly, in which 144 countries then did condemn Russia's invasion. That's not a binding resolution, but it was a very powerful statement of how isolated Russia is. So bottom line, Zelensky puts his finger on a serious problem, and there's not a lot that we can do about it to try to change the system.
Harold, is John right? Is the action, do we just move everything into the General Assembly? Is that a better place to try and get a solution here?
Well, let me give a broader answer. President Zelensky is my client, so I'm not going to say he's wrong. But you've all seen the movie Apollo 13, where the ship is stuck on the other side of the moon. And they say this is the worst disaster ever for the space program. And then Ed Harris says, I think this is our finest hour. And I'd certainly say that. So look, can we home in on the problem? The UN system, one part of it is stalemated at the moment. And it's stalemated because 2 of the permanent members, Russia and China, do not support the goals of the rules-based international order. But the entire UN is part of a much larger system, the Bretton Woods system, NATO, the G7, the WTO, and they're all functioning to isolate Russia. And as you saw in the last week with the G7 summit and the NATO summit, Biden has organized and rallied this group to isolate Putin and support Ukraine in a manner as we have not seen since 1990 during the first Gulf War. And I think it's a sign of exactly where the authority really lies, which is if you are an outlaw in an isolated outlaw in an interdependent world, there's not much you can do. Putin cannot now travel. He can't use a credit card. He can't get semiconductors. His oligarchs can't have yachts or football clubs. So he's been Pinochet, and that's just the beginning. And a final point, which I think is extremely important here, is that for those of us of a certain age, this is just a throwback to what we experienced during the Cold War. When I was studying law with my friend Elliot Gerson, the Russians vetoed everything. And so creative international lawyering meant working around the veto. Starting in 1987, Gorbachev, they started to cooperate. That went through 2011, but we're back into that position before. So of course now we have to go to the General Assembly. We have to go to the UN Human Rights Council. We have to go to the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice. Those organizations didn't exist in the early days. So I think it could be the finest hour.
Yeah, I served as UN correspondent for the Associated Press from 2000 to 2003, and it was a period of great frustration then too. You're right. We've sort of been down this road before, but John, we've also been down this road with Russia before in recent years, both in administrations that you served when there was Russian action in Georgia, in Crimea. Should we have done things a little bit differently a little earlier on?
Yeah, unfortunately, we have seen this movie before, and it's really pretty much the same movie. This is, Russia Part 3. 2008, remember Russia invaded Georgia using the same playbook, saying, the Georgians were committing human rights abuses or even genocide against the South Ossetians and the Abkhazians. So Georgia invaded, and, Russia invaded Georgia. And then, of course, the same thing happened in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. And in each case, Russia managed to nibble off a little piece of each of these countries, and they got away with it. And that's a problem. And so, of course, looking back, I think both administrations and people who've been critical of both administrations have said, should the Bush administration have done more in 2008? Should the Obama administration have done more in 2014? It's hard. In 2008, I was the legal advisor. I sat around the table and talked about everything we could possibly do. We considered military options at the time. Should the U.S. commit troops into Georgia? Harold can talk about what happened with respect to Crimea, but of course we don't commit forces lightly. In the Georgia situation, we ultimately got Russia to leave Georgia and not try to ultimately topple the Georgian government, but the Russians did walk off with a piece of Georgia, as they did again in Crimea. And this does unfortunately show the limits of the international system unless you're ultimately going to be willing to commit military action.
Harold?
So let's make it clear. Putin's short game is force. Our long game is law. Second, his short game failed. He thought they would run, and Zelensky and his people didn't run. So now we're in the second stage, and we're in for the long haul. But I think we should understand what is the strategy, the legal strategy. It's 5 parts. Isolation. Isolate Putin and his thugs in as many ways as possible. Illegality. Name what they're doing as illegal to enhance their isolation. Third, diplomacy. Drive them into a diplomatic arrangement because they're so weak. Fourth, accountability. When you're in the diplomatic situation, do not let them bargain away their responsibility for both civil and criminal violations, which is what essentially happened with Milosevic and Karadzic at Dayton. And fifth, information. Information is on the side of those who are seeking to support the values of the rules-based international order. Putin can't control that information. This is the best covered war and the most covered set of atrocities in our memory. So it'll take a long time for these 5 pieces to work. But yesterday you heard Biden say, as long as it takes. And obviously that's going to test everybody's patience. The price of gas will go up. And the question is, do we have the political will to stay the course? And that is, I think, the dilemma. The United States is obviously the world's greatest superpower with one of the most dysfunctional political systems, which makes it difficult to sustain this kind of strategy for the long term. And depending on what happens in elections, you could easily see this strategy break down. And Zelensky's feeling the pressure. He said, I need a solution by this winter. And that's obviously, again, a rhetorical point, but I think it leads to 2 other ideas. This is the Aspen Ideas Festival. One, an accelerated Dayton. We need to try to get to a process of negotiation led by the Ukrainians and their desires. And then the second is a fragmented Nuremberg. We're not going to have everybody in the dock at the same time. Putin is not in prison. The Nazi war criminals were. Putin has 200,000 troops and nuclear weapons. Yeah. And so we're going to have to pursue accountability against those we can in the places that we can. But again, eyes on the prize and stay focused. And, Putin made a tremendous miscalculation. And the question is, does the West have the endurance and the cooperative ability to make him pay for that mistake?
So talk a little bit about the International Court of Justice then, the UN's judicial arm. Is it going to be better there for holding Russia accountable? Is it effective? It doesn't have an enforcement mechanism?
Well, Daphne, as you know, there's not I learned this here from my boss, Justice Blackmun. I was just visiting his ashes. He said to me once, not a court in the world enforces its own judgments. Yeah. Well, it's true, The U.S. Supreme Court in the Pentagon Papers case didn't enforce its judgment. Yeah. the beauty of a court who follows the province and duty to say what the law is that once they issue an order, everybody enforces it. So we brought a case on behalf of the government of Ukraine against Russia on March 7th, and we got a provisional measures order on March 16th, which ordered the Russians to withdraw from the territory of Ukraine and also not to aggravate the dispute. And from that point on, the clock has been ticking. And we will be filing a brief asking for reparations. $300 billion is frozen. And so the question is going to be, when they enter negotiations, for Putin not to believe that those $300 billion are his to have back. And in the meantime, all of these other pieces of the international system are moving forward to try to create a situation of pervasive illegality. The European Court of Human Rights, the UN Human Rights Council, the WTO, international tribunals, domestic courts, the Ukrainian prosecutor. It's an all-hands-on-deck process. But again, his short game is force, our long game is law.
John, can you talk a little bit more about that, just looking at the International Criminal Court and what could be done there as a separate venue? And I mean, it's long-standing U.S. policy, has not supported that court. What do we need to do now?
So let me say a word quickly on the, Harold hasn't done justice to the case that he has brought on behalf of Ukraine at the ICJ, which is really interesting, and I'll move on quickly to the ICC. The ICJ is one country against another country, so countries sue each other. The ICC is prosecutions of individuals. But, the two interesting things on the ICJ case. One is sort of how Ukraine got into court, because Russia has not agreed to be sued for absolutely anything. They don't agree to what we call the general jurisdiction of the court. So you can only get into court if there's been a violation of a particular treaty. So Ukraine said, since Putin's justification for his invasion of Ukraine was he had said the Ukrainians are committing genocide, which of course was hogwash, but when Putin said that, he then hoisted himself on his own petard, because Ukraine then said, well, you've essentially accused us of a violation of the genocide treaty, which is a misinterpretation of the treaty, and that's enough to get us into court. And so I'm on Harold's territory here, but he got into court over that, and the court accepted that argument, at least provisionally. And then last fun fact on this, the current president of the court, the Chief Justice of the world, is an American lawyer named Joan Donahue, a woman who used to serve as Harold's and my principal deputy legal advisor. I had promoted her to be my deputy, and then she was acting legal advisor before Harold came in, and then together we nominated her to the court, and she was elected by her peers last year to be the Chief Justice of the world. So it's actually it's a pretty neat thing. So moving to the ICC, this actually may be really where the action is, where the teeth may be. As you know, International Criminal Court, created 20 years ago by a treaty called the Rome Statute. The U.S. is not a party, which we'll get to in a minute, because the U.S. has been concerned about politicized prosecutions of the U.S. I'll get to that. Russia's not a party either. So the question is, how can the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who is a new prosecutor, a British lawyer named Karim Khan, investigate Russia, which he's doing? And the answer is, Ukraine has accepted the special jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court for offenses that occur on its territory, which are obviously where these offenses that Russia has committed are. So the prosecutor of the ICC has announced in March that he's investigating crimes against humanity and war crimes. And this may be the biggest war crimes investigation ever conducted by the International Criminal Court. Sort of to Harold's meta picture here, this really is the moment, not only maybe for international law, but certainly for the International Criminal Court. There will undoubtedly be some indictments of some Russian officials. The question is, will he indict Putin himself? Now, you all are all thinking, well, how's he going to get Putin in a court in The Hague? How's he going to get any of these people? That is a good question. And I, frankly, would not be putting money on him getting Putin in The Hague. I do think we might see an indictment of Putin. He may get some other Russians in The Hague, but overall, if there are indictments by the International Criminal Court of a lot of senior Russian officials, that is a very strong statement. Last point. The U.S. is not a party to the International Criminal Court. This has put us in a difficult position and resulted in much interagency discussion in Washington, because the U.S., through successive administrations, has taken a pretty strong position, which I frankly think it's going to now have to back off of, saying we don't think that the court can ever exercise jurisdiction over non-parties. If you're not a party to the treaty, you can't exercise jurisdiction. Well, obviously, the U.S. would like the court to exercise jurisdiction over Russia, but how do we say that without being hoist on our own petard? So the Biden administration has said, we would like to support the court. I think ultimately we will get to the point, if it's not happening quietly already, that we will provide intelligence support and maybe some of our very good prosecutors and investigators. But we've not yet seen a big policy announcement of how we square historic U.S. concerns about the International Criminal Court with support for its investigation of Russia.
Because we don't want them to investigate us.
We don't want them to investigate, well, the problem, honestly, is with the Defense Department, which is concerned that they will be accused because they have military operations all around the world and unfortunately are regularly accused, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, of misconduct. And they don't want to be then hauled before the ICC. Frankly, rather than just saying it never applies to the United States, if you work your way through the terms of the statute, which require the court only has jurisdiction if the U.S. has not investigated its own people, what we call complementarity, it's a complementary court, then only then does the ICC have jurisdiction. So I think we can get to the point where we would say the United States supports the ICC's investigation of Russia, but we don't support its investigation of the United States because we do investigate our own war crimes.
And Harold, the last administration, they weakened the court in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so a couple things. First, certain Republican administrations, but particularly those who hired John Bolton, tend to demonize the court without any obvious gain from doing so. So at the end of the last administration, it wasn't clear that Trump had any particular stake in this, but when Bolton was briefly in as national security advisor, they decided to impose sanctions on the prosecutor and the deputy prosecutor, and also anybody who supported them, which included academics from around the world. So this is not a good way to make friends. So the Biden administration, and I was there in April of last year, withdrew those sanctions. But the further question is that they quietly dismantled the mechanisms of quiet cooperation, sharing intelligence, et cetera, and those are now being rebuilt. But I think and you know, there were problems with the last prosecutor. They now have a good new prosecutor, as John has said. He said he sees a reasonable basis to pursue war crimes investigations in Ukraine going back to 2014. So it's very much in our interest to cooperate. The irony is that with the urging of Bolton and others, Congress passed a law called the American Service Members Protection Act, which essentially made illegal, with a significant exception, cooperation with the ICC. Now, of course, senators like Lindsey Graham have found religion and think we should cooperate with the ICC. But the law is still there, chilling U.S. Justice Department officials. And my view is that we should ask these senators who have now seen the light to authorize. Well, why shouldn't we send 20 prosecutors from the Justice Department to The Hague tomorrow on U.S. government money, help them to work on this? We could include in it JAG officers and former U.S. attorneys who are now pro bono partners at big law firms. I'm sure you'd have a very quick compliment and try to jumpstart this accountability effort, which is going to be going on for many months. Finally, John, was nice to mention, with regard to the ICJ case, the simple fact is that Putin lied about the facts, as he said that Ukraine was committing genocide, and then he lied about the law. He said that that authorized Russia to use force to prevent genocide. And so he claimed that he was not committing aggression, he was stopping genocide. But on his lies, we founded jurisdiction, and 13-2, the judges said that there is prima facie jurisdiction. So when you overplead, you get yourself into a trap.
To John's point, are indictments and prosecutions the goal here? Is that helpful?
No, I think we should, again, step back to the big picture. What is going on here? We have a campaign of atrocities in service of aggression on a scale that we've never seen since World War II. And the Russians are deliberately and openly, at a distance, engaging in indiscriminate bombing of civilians, children, hospitals, etc. And then when they get up close and occupy an area, as they do in Bucha, they just slaughter people, throw them into mass graves. And this is happening in the face of all manner of rules against both this kind of aggression and this kind of atrocity. So you need to, essentially what's going on is the Ukrainian effort is to engage in lawfare. Namely, we fight on the court, they fight in the battleground where the Ukrainians are opposing them. But there are three broad circles of activity. One is pushing on this International Court of Justice case. Third, criminal accountability with regard to the International Criminal Court, but also setting up a process to try Putin and his thugs for aggression. And then the third, a process of civil reparations, where these $300 billion in frozen assets can be used to help reconstruct critical infrastructure in Ukraine. And finally, we have a problem, which is basically that right now the battle is going on at the seaports that are not in Russian-controlled territory, Odessa, Snake Island. And that's because the Russians are trying to choke off the flow of grain, which is what makes Ukraine an independent nation. And that's what's fueling a global food crisis right now.
Yeah. Let me say one more thing, since it looks like we've got a minute. So Harold's mentioned aggression a couple of times, which is obviously, the original sin here. Before we get to war crimes and crimes against humanity and even genocide, what Putin has done is invaded his neighbor, which violates the bedrock cornerstone of the UN Charter that you can't threaten or invade your neighbors. So the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over 4 offenses: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and aggression. But the aggression offense only applies to countries that have specifically accepted that. So Ukraine could accept jurisdiction for war crimes and crimes against humanity applying to Russia, but not with respect to aggression, because Russia's never agreed to that. So the problem is that the prosecutor can't investigate Russia for aggression, which really is the big issue here. So he is investigating them for war crimes. I think he's going to indict for war crimes, but there's, and watch this spot. There's a lot of talk amongst international lawyers, international criminal lawyers, is since the International Criminal Court can't investigate the original sin of aggression here, should we set up an additional special purpose tribunal just to investigate aggression? There are a number of ways that have been proposed to do that, but back to something that we've been talking about, the General Assembly could, if the votes are there, which they appear to be, could vote to work with Ukraine itself to set up a special purpose additional tribunal to investigate aggression. And probably the main target for that would be, who, Putin. So then the question is, well, does it really make sense to have 2 tribunals? The ICC investigating war crimes and crimes against humanity, and then this additional tribunal investigating aggression. I have to say, I see the pros and cons of each. I'm frankly a little bit worried about balkanizing too many tribunals. Sitting here right now, I would kind of lean against the additional tribunal, but I get it, that would be a way to indict Putin himself for aggression. I don't know how you come out on that, Harold.
Well, Daphne, you asked, is the objective indictments and accountability. Those are pinprick elements of the broader strategy, which is isolate Russia through illegality, and by that isolation, drive them into a diplomatic negotiation where they have a weaker hand because they don't have a claim on all the assets, and because they're going to have to pay for the damage done and the people that they've killed, and in the process, hopefully delegitimate Putin so that the Russian people see that they probably have a better deal going forward with somebody else. And it may not be the liberal wing, the Navalny's. You know, it might be like the way that Yuri Andropov went, which is, you know, the KGB has a way of replacing someone who's leading the country into chaos. And I think that that's the end game, or that this is one version of how it ends. Now, another version of how it ends is that through brute force and you know, military might, Russia prevails, but at this point, it doesn't look like they're getting that much traction, except along the line of the Donbass down to Crimea. So even already, their broader strategy of taking over all of Ukraine has failed. But it comes back to a point about Zelensky's original statement. Yeah. Do we really want to kick Russia out of the club that they want to be in the good graces of to get back into the world community? If you isolate them, say they're an outlaw, then in the subsequent negotiations, they have to do more to get back into the good graces of this club, which, so, you know, when you're in a club.
Wasn't that the G7, G8 issue? I mean, when Putin was kicked out of the G8.
Yeah, then you don't have to answer to these people anymore, you know? I mean, this was one of Trump's strategies. Leave, and then it turns out nobody listens to you after you leave. So not a great strategy, you know? And so the same thing is to isolate and make a pariah, which sets the terms by which you're brought back from the penalty box. And that's what we should be looking at, that organic process of how they're going to, at what point they start thinking about the future. And that would mean at some point Putin abandoning his dream of returning to an old Soviet Union. Because frankly, it's not getting his people very much. It's getting them sanctions, it's getting them huge problems at home, and we're not yet into the winter.
And we're not yet into the winter, that's such a good point. And you talked about Biden just coming off this G7 summit now and that sense of unity. We just talked quite a bit here about what the U.S. could do. What are our allies doing in this space to help effectuate, you know, anything that can be taken place in any of the UN organizations or international organizations?
Well, they're doing a lot, and they're basically following the U.S. lead. So the Biden administration responded from the difficult situation in Afghanistan to really lead this really extraordinary effort. And look what's happened. You know, NATO has expanded its line 800 miles. They include now Finland and Sweden. They have more unity than they ever had. You know, Trump wanted to withdraw from NATO. Where would we be at this point? Now, the real problem is our NATO allies are wondering what happens if Biden loses the midterms. Will that still be that unity of purpose? And that's an obvious concern. He doesn't know the answer to it. At the G7 summit, most of the questions that Biden was getting was about Roe versus Wade, yeah. Which is like, you know, are there forces in your country you can't control? Answer yes, because we have a system of checks and balances, and some of those checks are pretty unbalanced.
John.
So two things. One, let me go back first briefly to the international level.
Now you know why I'm moderating this.
To the international level. You know, as Harold says, there is a lot that the international community, that the UN, the ICJ, the ICC are doing. There are other things. Russia's been voted out of the Human Rights Council. They just voted right out. The Council of Europe voted right out. So they really are being isolated. The UN is not a perfect institution, but you know, it does get things done. I'm fond of quoting actually our longest serving UN ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, who served actually during this period from 1953 to 1960 when Russia was either just vetoing everything or just not even attending. And Lodge was getting criticism about the UN even in those days. And he said, look, the UN was not created to take us to heaven. It was created to prevent us from going to hell. And, it really is true. This is not a perfect institution, but it does get stuff done together. But on this point, what could countries do nationally? Now, that's not pure international because it's not by treaty or international institution, but as Harold said, this may be one of the greatest multilateral efforts coming together that we have seen for a long time. We've got Japan, Korea, Singapore, all putting sanctions on Russia, completely isolated financially and in terms of travel, and it is having a very significant effect. At the G7 just earlier this week, more sanctions were put on more oligarchs, more Russian companies, and this will have an effect. And I think we'll actually see more seizures here in the United States and elsewhere. So it is a big international effort, both in international law and institutions, but also with countries working together.
But Daphne, I think going back to the long game strategy, the 5 points, they can isolate, they can make illegal, they can push into diplomacy, they can encourage accountability in as many forms as possible, and they can share information. So everybody can contribute to that effort.
Great. I think there's some folks with microphones, so I think it's time for you guys to ask the better questions. There's people on both sides. I'll point out, and she'll bring you the microphone. Thanks. Just let us know who you are if you can.
Yeah, I'm Harold Zlot from San Francisco. The question I have is how all of this legal approach and sanctions approach is great, but what can the UN do to stop the butchering of civilians in the Ukraine? You mentioned Bucha, and I just saw in the paper today that the Russians are going after Odessa. So is there any sort of military action that the UN can take? I know the UN was useless in Rwanda. They stepped aside and everybody got killed. And so the title of the program here is how good is the UN? And I really suggest that we have to look at something where we can have more military action. I think that a big mistake was made by not giving Ukraine the MiG jets from Poland, and that was a mistake on the United States. But I'm only concerned of how much more killing can go on.
Great question.
I'll take a quick stab. I mean, the problem, you put your finger on the problem, which was the very first thing we discussed, is if the Security Council, which is the wing of the UN that actually can order military action, and they have, and they can, and they do, and that's how the two Iraq conflicts have gotten authorized. But if one of the members of the Security Council vetoes it, then they can't authorize military action. So in that regard, the General Assembly can't do it. So countries then have to step in individually and do it. So, and that is what the U.S. and other countries, particularly the U.K., but we've even seen Germany step up to provide military support to Ukraine. But in this case, this is that weakness in the UN system.
I think we have to understand two anomalies that we can't fix about the current situation. Number one, Ukraine is not in NATO. So the United States will fight to protect every inch of Estonia, which is a country with 1.4 million people, but they cannot fight to protect the internal workings of Ukraine, which is a country with 44 million people. Problem number two is, therefore, the United States doesn't declare war on Russia. There are two different conflicts going on. There's Russia versus Ukraine, and then there's Russia against the world legal order. And the U.S. is helping with Ukraine to orchestrate the entire second effort. But within the frame that we've constructed, and you may not like it, but there's not much you can do to get away from it, the United States provides support to the Ukrainians to do all of these different things. And yesterday in Madrid, Biden announced a whole new set of things they're going to do, including air defense, missiles, et cetera, more military aid, more humanitarian aid. That's as much as they can do without actually entering the conflict and without actually entering into Ukrainian territory. the UN maybe had a possibility to do a no-fly zone during the period when refugees were having trouble getting out, but then the Russians pulled back, and so there are parts of Ukraine where people can stay, so they don't need to do that. So that, I think, is, we're just going to have to live with these two anomalies because of this particular situation.
I know, deeply unsatisfying. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Gillian Sorensen, and I might preface what I'm saying by mentioning that I've worked 25 years in the United Nations, and of course I listened carefully to all you have said. I do agree that the UN is imperfect, but indispensable. We've focused very much on the Ukraine situation in the Security Council, but I'm acutely aware that also the UN has achieved a great deal in areas of health, human rights, climate change, women's rights, the rights of girls, safe birth, refugees, and so much more than just the military issues. And that it matters enormously if the U.S. is visible, active, and present, which it was not during the 4 years of the previous presidency. So would you reflect just for a couple of minutes on this larger question of the U.S. and the UN, the purpose of diplomacy, the value of diplomacy, and how it does, in fact, benefit us despite its shortcomings?
That's a great question.
Go
Great
ahead, Harold.
opportunity, Harold.
Well, I've been on sabbatical working on a book, which I encourage you all to buy.
It's not written yet, is it?
It's getting there. But, you know, the basic bipartisan strategy through George H.W. Bush, but through the Democratic administrations, has been engage, translate, and leverage. When in doubt, the United States engages with our diplomatic allies. When in doubt, we translate legal rules into new situations like cyber conflict, and then we leverage this into long-term diplomatic solutions. Trump, but also George W. Bush, follow the opposite approach, disengage. In other words, America first. No translation. In other words, we're not doing things because of legal rules, we're doing things because of power politics, and then no leverage, and therefore no capacity to mobilize organizations. Biden has boiled it down in the last few months into two very simple ideas. Invest in democratic alliances and show that democracy delivers. And every speech he gives now, look for those two messages. And what he's saying is that this is the way forward. This is, has to be the way forward. The problem is that this isolationist view is not shared by people who are running against him. The real question is, what will they do if they come in? Will they have the capacity to... we used to have a lot of continuity in foreign policy, but now we have radical swings, and that, I think, has really hurt our image abroad, as you know, better than anybody.
I'm not going to take the jab at the Bush administration for disengaging. As you know, very much engaged, particularly PEPFAR, probably saved millions of lives in Africa, and a lot of engagement on issues involving Iran, North Korea, various other things. But let's move on.
Well, George Bush is now a hero.
Go ahead.
My name is Bruce McEver. What do we do to give the UN more teeth? We have incredible intelligence these days. We know when things are going on, genocides and stuff. How do countries contribute small battalions of Green Berets or something that could be organized and go and stop these things, even the smaller thing? You know, how do we fix this rather than saying, woe is me, we can't fix the UN Charter? Why don't we try to fix it? How do you do it? What would make the UN more effective? Let's turn it around.
Why don't you start?
Yeah, well,
I'll just take the last word.
it's a great question. It, again, is very difficult. I mean, one, you cannot have military action unless all of the P5 members agree. So even if we come up with a good UN force, the P5 members have to agree to it. It's also quite difficult to share information with the UN because all of the countries are members. So the US can't say, well, we're sharing this sensitive intelligence, but it can only go to this group of 10 countries because we don't trust those other countries. So that makes it difficult. when we sanction individuals or countries around the world, the U.S. has figured out ways to share information with the UN so that countries can be sanctioned. But let me just quickly go to where I think we're really going to see sharing is with the International Criminal Court. This really is going to be the moment for the ICC. They are probably swimming in information for the first time in their 20-year history. Countries, including, I hope, the US, I hope this will happen, are falling all over each other to share probably quite sensitive information about Russian intercepts with the prosecutor so that he can show the intent that is necessary to bring a war crimes prosecution. So sharing with the UN itself, very difficult to do. Ms. Sorensen can tell you based on her experience, you can't just share it with some but not others. But I think with the ICC prosecutor, although you have some of the same problems, that we'll see some effective sharing.
Harold.
Well, one of the two most effective Secretary Generals of my lifetime, Kofi Annan, actually at the millennium took a non-event, namely the millennial change, to convene a whole bunch of studies about UN reform. So the plans are all there. But the problem is that the crisis that creates the opportunity to actually effectuate those changes hasn't happened yet. And one question is, will this be something of the magnitude of World War II that leads a push to these kinds of reforms? Because we may not want Russia and China vetoing everything. But one thing I learned from my time in the government is every country in the world that's part of the UN thinks that they're doing something really important, and they are. Korea, which is my ancestral homeland, is participating in all these different UN entities, and in a very constructive way, and they're very proud of it. The little island of Fiji is phenomenal at peacekeeping forces. They send 30, 40 peacekeepers to a whole bunch of different peacekeeping units, and they make a gigantic difference. Estonia has been a huge lead with regard to cyber security. Lithuania is taking one of the leads with regard to aggression. So, if you watch Borgen, Denmark sees itself as a small law-abiding country that's making a huge contribution to the rule of law. So I think we should not think of these as something that the United States own. Every UN member thinks that they own the UN. And at a time like this, when the whole system is under threat, maybe there'll be, at some point, enough of a critical mass to start to put some of these broader reform efforts in place. But even if not, the fact of collective mobilization will create a kind of positive energy that will make this a positive moment for the UN.
We're out of time, but 2 seconds. One thing I would like to see more of is the Secretary General, I think Guterres has not done enough personally to try to broker a solution. We've not seen him doing a lot. But again, it may be simply that neither side is interested in having him do it.
Please help me thank our panel. They were fantastic.